Contrary to popular belief, size does matter. Let's talk about how your job size might be affecting your ability to get your job running on the farm. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this one, maybe share it on social media. Hey, so this is the next in a series of videos I'm doing about why your job might be stuck on the farm. For this one, we're going to look at one of the more common reasons that your job's not picking up, and that's because it might have too much RAM required, it might need too many cores, or it might be really long frame times. We're mostly going to focus on those first two. Now later in this video, I'm going to give you a few solid processes that your studio can implement, that you can implement on your team, that will really help you reduce this job size problem. Let's face it, most of the largest jobs that are on a farm are often attributed to or being contributed by the biggest, baddest artists in the facility doing some of the craziest work. And so I'd prefer to call it consumptive, and I don't really pass judgment on whether the job is too big, but there are some realities if the job has to be big that you're going to have to face when you try to get it to run on the farm. So the first thing we want to do is look at how does a render team break up a farm so that it can be used by multiple artists. Now we're going to take a typical machine. I just highlighted this machine in one of my most recent videos. We're going to assume that this machine has 128 cores and 512 gigabytes of memory. Yes, that is the type of machine we're deploying these days. So let's assume you have a whole farm of these and there's 64 of them. So first, let's look at how a render wrangler is going to divide up this machine. So you start off with this raw machine with a half a terabyte of RAM and 128 cores. Now, most jobs don't need anywhere near that much RAM or that many cores to run efficiently. So then you have to ask, how should a wrangler break this machine up so it can run multiple frames? Well, the first thing they can do is just divide it in half and make it two different frames that can run on this machine. And each frame will get access to 64 cores and 256 gigabytes of RAM. That's still a pretty large job. And although we see them these days, it's still considered the upper end of what a job size should be. As you go down further, you might say, well, let's break it up into 4 frames running at the same time. And each frame will have access to 32 cores and 128 gigabytes of RAM. Still a pretty large job, but now you can at least get 4 frames running on the same machine. So as we scroll down, you'll see, hey, maybe we can actually put 8 slots on this machine and run 8 frames at the same time, because they'll still get access to 16 cores and 64 gigabits. The ones we deploy have 10 gigabit NICs, and these new AMD machines can really handle this kind of load. But then there's like, say, nuke jobs, or very small scripted processes that don't need a lot of cores at all. Well, you can run potentially 16 of these small jobs that only use 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. So I gave an example below as well, where on dynamic farms, and we're not going to talk about that too much today, but there is the ability on more dynamic farms to be able to put different sized frames on the same machine and really make good, healthy use of that machine, putting both large and small frames at the same time. So here's a typical render farm where a team has decided to break it up as such. So they can have half the farm run 8 frames per machine, and they've put a little corner of the farm up for the really small tasks. They can run 16 of those per machine. And then they've made a little room up at the upper end for the larger machines. And this could, again, dynamically change throughout the day based on the render loads. But let's assume that you've got a monster job. You've got a job that's going to require 256 gigs or close to 256 gigs of RAM. So as you can see on this farm, it's only going to have 8 machines that it can run on. And it's only going to be able to run 16 concurrent frames. Unless the render wranglers can free up more machines, which we'll talk about in a minute, you're really going to be limited. So if you're and other artists have jobs that are sitting on this farm that are that large, you can imagine you're going to be waiting hours, if not days, for your job to run. But let's say it's not that large, but it's still needing nearly 128 gigabytes of RAM. Well, the unfortunate reality is there's still only so much of that farm available to you. Yes, there are now more machines that frame can run on as they're currently configured, but the reality is you can get 24 machines going now, and you can get 80 concurrent frames. That's a heck of a lot better than you were back then with just having it go up to 256. So you can start to see why getting it below a certain threshold can really open up a lot of the farm. But let's continue through a few more examples. So we're going to continue down the line here. And let's assume you've got it down to that standard job footprint I talked about, where you have it down to needing no more than 64 gigabytes of RAM. Well, in this case, you now have the run of the farm. Your job is likely going to pick up at a reasonable time. It's going to finish at a reasonable time. And it's just a matter of your production prioritizing that job above others. But the reality is now you've got the, vast majority of the farm. You can run up to 56 machines. That's nearly the whole farm. And you can run up to 336 maximum concurrent frames. So you and your other artists can all push jobs of this size and generally fill the farm comfortably with a little bit of wiggle room and elbow room. But now let's go ahead and take a look at the final one. This is the smallest type. I mentioned that there'll be nuke jobs sometimes that don't take up a lot of space or need a lot of RAM. Sometimes it's internal processes, batch processes, and scripted processes that the pipeline team have written that are running on the farm. You can often run a lot of these all on one machine. So let's assume these jobs come in and they only need 8 cores or 32 gigs of RAM. Well, in this case, they have the whole farm. They can actually run, as it's currently configured in its diverse configuration, they can run 64 machines. They have access to the whole farm. And as it's currently configured, they can run up to 464 simultaneous frames or concurrent frames at the same time. So when there's a big surge of these jobs, often the Wranglers can put them through on almost any machine and just get them through the farm and get them into your daily session or whatever quick turnaround you need on your small dailies jobs. But you may have heard there that I hinted as it's currently configured, because let's face it, if you had a bunch of big jobs on the farm and these things were the shot that had to be delivered to the director today, this is the big shot, and you don't have the time to optimize it, you don't have the time to make it smaller, well, you can appeal upon the studio and upon the farm to reconfigure the farm to simply handle 2 frames per machine across the entire farm. Now you can imagine that completely idles the farm for everyone else. This is a very extreme act, and it's rare that you see the entire farm flipped to one job to handle one job, but you might see half or more of the farm flipped if it's really the big delivery shot for some friends and family screening or final delivery where it's just must go through that day. Well, sometimes these decisions have to happen, and there's a huge cost to the studio in folks who can't render while this happens. But the reality is you can flip an entire farm to handle the biggest job that I gave as an example, 256 gigs of RAM or up to that, and you can run 64 machines and get 128 concurrent frames. So even though you've idled the whole farm, you can still only get 128 frames running at once. And it's a real big price to pay. And if your studio is making that choice more than once or twice in a year, boy, you got to think about how your farm is being operated, and is it sized properly or being operated within parameters that are reasonable, because that's destructive to a studio. And there's a flip side of that example. Let's assume there's a massive backlog of tiny jobs. Let's assume there's some massive recompositing of the whole show that has to happen. Or so if you take the smallest job I gave you at needing up to 32 gigs and you flipped the whole farm to handle these, you could get 1,024 concurrent frames running all at once. So you could flip the farm and knock out just tens of thousands of frames and flip it back and really knock out a large volume of fast frames using this method. So you can understand now how your job size really reflects almost exponentially how much farm you can get at any one time. That's not even considering the frame size, which again, I'm going to do a whole nother video on frame length. Another thing that might work against you here is if your job is really long. So if you have really long frame times, whatever the weight of the problem is, meaning you're only able to run on 8 machines, or you're only able to get 24 machines of the whole farm because your job is so large, if it's also running really long per frame, it's just a multiplier of the same problem. So keep that in mind. And again, I'm going to do a whole one of these videos on frame times and the effects of frame time, not just in length of frames, but also the number of frames per job, which can have its own numeric effect. But really, this is about your job being too big. So as an example, I recently just gave an example in a recent video about how a farm is really like a maitre d', and it's just putting the jobs at a table. It doesn't know what you want to order. So a lot of farms aren't that smart, and they just act like a maitre d'. They're just going to find you a table, and they don't know what you want to order. So you just simply say, hey, I've got 2 jobs here that can go on a machine. It'll find a machine that opens up, and it'll put those 2 jobs there. Or it might say, I need this one job for 1 machine, a table for 1, if you will. And once it sees a table open up, it'll put that 1 job on there. So like that maitre d' example that I showed in the previous video, okay, let's imagine somebody arrives at this restaurant, but they don't need a table anymore for 1 or 2, but it's 1 single person and they need a table for 6. That's what they need. So that's sort of like when one of these large jobs comes into a farm and you say, hey, I need to flip more machines to handle this very, very large job. You're basically going into a restaurant and saying, hey, I need a booth table for 6 and it's just going to be me alone. And so it's reasonable. You can ask for that. A restaurant will do what it can to accommodate. But what it's going to have to do, most likely, unless it has booths available, and who the heck, has machines available on a farm. So that maitre d' is going to look out there, and it's going to have to wait for 1 table to clear up, and then it's going to have to wait for a 2nd table to clear up, and a 3rd table. And then once it can put 3 tables together, it can say, okay, I've assembled and reconfigured a machine to handle your job. You have to wait for all those other folks to leave. So this means that you have idle portions of a machine while you're waiting for a whole machine to free up so that you can turn it over to handle one of these large jobs. That idle time of the machine waiting for the rest of it to free up, basically being in a pause state on the other potential frames it could run, until it can eventually flip over and handle this large job, is wasted farm time. And then, of course, you have the opportunity cost. You have the fact that now that you flip this machine to handle just 1 or 2 frames of this very large job, you've got 5, 10, dozen frames that could be running at the same time. And those artists are now waiting for that large job. And this is, again, why you want to have your job have the smallest footprint possible. And so I wanted to give some examples of how you can tackle this problem, whether the job is simply too big and it could be optimized, or whether the job is simply as small as it's ever going to get because of the time constraints and job constraints. You're going to have to get this job through the farm. So let's go through some concrete steps that you can take at your studio to make sure that you get these large jobs accommodated wherever you can. The first thing to do is to find out from your render wranglers what are those RAM and core tiers or standards matchups. Some studios will actually size up their farms to be, say, 4 cores always get 16 gigabytes. And so if it's 8 core, it's always going to get, 32 gigabytes. And so they'll just pair it up that way linearly and make it a little easier for people to submit. Sometimes you just choose the RAM and it selects the cores based on the machine. It really depends on how your studio does it, but it's worth it for you to find out how do they dole it out. And the most important thing you want to find out is what are those tiers. In this case, I gave you those pretty large tiers of 64 gigs, 32 gigs, and you had 128, 256. Those are very large jobs, but those are the tiers for this example. So you know that if you can just keep it below this tier, you can get so much more farm added to your potential pool. So you know when you look at one of these jobs, once you know the tiers, that if you can just get it down 1 or 2 gigabytes of RAM, you'll drop into the next tier and huge portions of the farm will open up. So when I talk about optimizing your job, I'm not talking about reducing it in half. I mean, very, very few jobs actually are exactly 256 and 128. If you've got a 96 or an 86 gigabyte job, it's still going to need a 128 gigabyte slot to fit it because it needs to over provision, make sure you have enough room. So the idea here is to just get it down to the next tier. So if the example is maybe you're running at 70 gigabytes of RAM and you can get it down to 63 gigabytes of RAM, boom, more than half the farm just opened up to you as a option, as a potential render machine for your job. It means your job's going to get done much faster. Not because you took it from 70 to 35 and did a 50% reduction, but you just got it from 70 to 63. That's so important. That little bit and getting it just below the tier is your target. You don't have to save everything. Just get it down to the next tier and you'll almost always be happier when you enter the farm or you're waiting for your job to pick up. Now, a way to tally that, especially if you're in production or you're trying to manage it as a lead or a supervisor, is to have the Wranglers generate a daily big jobs report. In the past, I would generate this studio-wide for all the leads and soups and producers. You could see the top 10 jobs that were consuming the farm, the top 10 jobs that needed the most RAM, the top 10 jobs with the longest frame times. You'd be surprised, number one, how much productions didn't realize certain artists were generating certain loads. So they'll often step in and say, hey, push that shot off, or why is that shot so big? And then there's a secondary effect. Because you're putting out to the whole studio the top 10 list across the studio, you'll find you can use the busybody nature of other productions who maybe are wondering why they can't get enough farm, and they see another production doing a very consumptive job at the same time. They might say, if you go in and just reduce your sample size a little bit or turn off these elements that you're not using, your RAM usage will go way down. You'll find that the vested interest of other shows will often give you the greatest feedback on their competing shows because they want to get access to the farm too. So you'll see that low-hanging fruit can often be harvested by the show seeing their own report or other shows seeing the other show's reports and sort of calling it out from afar. A little bit of sort of peer competitive showing of the dirty laundry, if you will, right? If you've got a highly consumptive job that took up half the farm and the rest of the studio sees that and the other shows see that, they're likely going to comment or question why you're using so much farm, and maybe they have a really constructive way to help you reduce that load. And that leads me to my third suggestion here. This is something we did at a studio I worked at called Image Movers Digital. It was a studio that was basically doing one movie at a time. For this, we were doing A Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey, and we were finding, because it was a new studio with a lot of new pipelines, there was a lot of bloat at times when it came to render and optimization. It's just the nature of it being a new studio and doing cutting edge work. So as a result, we had a hard time getting ahead of this with the farm being consumed with just a handful of jobs. So the CG supervisors for the show created a team with a terrible name and a wonderful purpose. It was called the RATS, the Render Assistance Task Squad. Again, terrible name. Great team. And what this team was a team of CG supervisors, a handful of ATDs and a couple of TDs, and then our most senior render wranglers who were basically leads or future ATDs. We would have them on an alias, and then we'd occasionally would meet maybe once a week or every couple of days, but generally it was all about having this alias, an email alias. And when a wrangler would see a job that was really consumptive, they would just flag it to the rats. So it wasn't exactly an official process or something where we would complete every render, but you would immediately have a TD or a render wrangler or a ATD, or sometimes a CG soup would just jump on a really large render that would show up in the email alias and just say, hey, turn off this plugin, or this is because the object is going through the camera lens, and so that's creating really large render times. Just back off the last couple of frames or something. Really, I'm not an artist, right? They would make the suggestions, but the idea of having this squad of really smart render savvy people, all in the same alias, seeing these really large jobs come in throughout the day, and it was just an email. Would allow us that nearly every day we would trim 2 or 3 of the largest jobs off the farm. And that really mattered. Again, if you go back to the render diet video I did, you'll see how much a reduction of just a few of your largest jobs can free up the farm for the entire studio. So the take home is, if your job is very large on the farm, and I'm not saying it's too large, but if it's large and if it's above a certain tier of memory or cores required, it's going to shrink considerably the amount of farm available to your job. And if there's less farm available, that means there's going to be more competition and longer wait times for that job to pick up. And the idea here is to always have your farm jobs, your team's farm jobs, and really the entire production's farm jobs always trying to aim to just below whatever the tier is that they're getting close to. And it just opens up the resources for everyone. So let's try to get those big jobs down. And if you can't, talk to your CG supervisor, talk to your render wranglers. Reach out to your community and say, hey, I got this job that just seems like it's a little too big. You'd be amazed at what little things your coworkers and peers will find that were just some simple checkbox that you didn't uncheck, or something you didn't turn off or turn on. Look to your peers. They're your best resource for helping you assess why is your job too big, and if you get it smaller, you'll be rewarded with a much faster render that will pick up quicker and get to your dailies faster. So that's the goal, right? Hope that helped. Take care, everyone. And of course, I've got to say, make sure you log off your machine tonight and make sure that it's getting added to the whole render farm so your machine can help overnight with the render loads. See you, everybody.